Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you are watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. I used to work the overnight shift as an assistant manager at a Holiday Inn Express in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, back in 2019. The building sat right off Interstate 83, a rectangular structure with a big illuminated sign guests could spot as they pulled off the exit. I had been working there for almost a year by the time October rolled around, long enough to know the rhythm of the night hours. The lobby stayed quiet except for the soft hum of the automatic doors and the faint hum of the soda machine against the far wall. Most nights unfolded the same way. A few late check-ins, some third shift truckers picking up coffee, and then several long, slow hours where nothing moved but the security cameras cycling through their feeds. On the night this happened, my shift started at 11. The air outside had that cool, early fall bite, but inside the hotel it was warm, the lobby smelling faintly of cinnamon from the evening batch of cookies that still sat on the tray near the front desk. The night auditor scheduled with me was Kelsey, a quiet girl in her early 20s who always kept her hood up and her headphones on. She worked efficiently, but never really engaged with anything outside her checklist. We weren't close. We barely exchanged more than a few nods. She liked it that way, and honestly, so did I. The overnight shift tends to attract people who want dark corners, stability, and minimal interaction. The first couple hours passed without anything unusual. I spent most of it reviewing inventory logs and checking security footage, while she sat at the computer in the back office working through her audit tasks. Around 1:40 in the morning, she stepped out from behind the desk and walked toward the elevator, her badge lanyard swinging against her chest. She held the basement keys in her hand. She scribbled something on the shift communication log and headed down without a word. That wasn't unusual. The supply closet was in the basement near the laundry room, and sometimes the cleaning crew left things unstocked. I didn't think much about it until 10 minutes passed, then 15. By 20, I glanced around the quiet lobby and felt a small pulse of concern. The cameras showed an empty elevator lobby downstairs, no sign of her. I called the basement desk phone, the landline most employees used when their radios died or when they wanted to avoid static in the stairwells. It rang several times with no answer. I figured maybe she had stepped out back for a smoke break. Plenty of employees did, even though it wasn't officially allowed. Another 20 minutes passed. The silence started to feel heavier. The hotel at night has a particular stillness, especially after 200 a.m., a stillness that can make something as simple as a missing coworker feel more ominous than it should. I finally decided to go downstairs and check. I grabbed the basement keyring, clipped it to my belt, and walked to the service stairwell behind the laundry chute. The stairwell always smelled like old concrete and stale detergent. The light flickered slightly near the top step, something maintenance kept promising to fix but never got around to. As I descended, the temperature dropped a few degrees. The basement of that hotel always felt colder than the rest of the building, partly because the industrial washers gave off humidity that made the place feel damp even when it wasn't freezing. The basement wasn't large, just a corridor lined with utility rooms, maintenance closets, and the laundry area where housekeepers dumped linens during the day. I stepped onto the concrete floor and heard the distant rumble of a washer cycling. The hallway lights buzzed faintly overhead, giving the whole place a washed-out, slightly sickly yellow tone. My shoes made small echoes as I walked past the shelves, stocked with cleaning solutions and bulk paper goods. The supply closet door was half open, its light spilling a narrow rectangle onto the concrete floor. The air smelled strongly of fabric softener and wet cotton. I slowed down, expecting to hear her rustling around inside, or maybe rolling out a cart. But the only sounds were the machines humming behind me, and a faint drip somewhere deeper in the building. When I reached the doorway, I saw her immediately. She was standing near the back wall between two tall metal racks filled with plastic, wrapped linens and boxes of toiletries. She wasn't moving. She wasn't reaching for anything. She wasn't even turned toward the supplies. She stood facing the wall, her hands pressed flat against it, shoulder width apart. like she was bracing herself or waiting for instructions. Her shoulders rose and fell quickly, like she had been running or crying, but I couldn't see her face from where I was standing. For a moment, I thought maybe she was sick or had fainted and caught herself on the wall. Something about the posture didn't look right, though. It looked deliberate, intentional, like she was frozen in the middle of doing something she didn't want anyone to witness. As I stepped into the room, I heard a small sound, a whisper, too fast and too low to understand. She was repeating something over and over again under her breath, her voice shaking. It didn't sound like words meant for me. It sounded like something she had been saying for a long time, something she needed to say. The way someone practices a sentence they're afraid to speak. The metal racks rattled slightly as I approached, the loose boxes vibrating from the movement of air. She didn't turn. She didn't acknowledge that I'd entered. It wasn't until I reached out and gently touched her shoulder that she reacted. Her whole body jolted like she had been shocked. She spun so fast she hit the metal shelving behind her, sending a few small shampoo bottles clattering to the floor. Her breathing came in short, panicked bursts. For a moment, she didn't seem to recognize where she was, like she had just been snapped out of a trance. Then she moved past me quickly, almost frantically. She grabbed the cleaning cart waiting outside the closet and practically bolted down the hallway toward the elevator. She kept her head down the whole time. I tried to catch her eye, but she avoided even glancing in my direction. She reached the elevator, pressed the button with trembling fingers, and disappeared behind the closing doors. The whole encounter lasted maybe 20 seconds, but it left the closet feeling colder than before. I stood there a while longer, listening to the washing machine's thump and churn. The whispering she had been doing replayed in my mind, the rhythm of it, the urgency behind it. I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't been random. It had sounded like someone rehearsing something they were terrified to say out loud. When I returned to the lobby, the desk area looked exactly as we had left it. Her headphones were still on the counter, one ear cup twisted and the cord tangled. On the shift log, I noticed what she had scribbled before going downstairs. It was just a note reminding herself to restock coffee supplies. Nothing odd. Nothing that explained why she had been standing alone in the basement whispering at a wall. For the rest of the night, she avoided me completely. She finished her audit at record speed, barely making any noise, and left at the exact minute her shift ended. I watched her walk out into the early morning dark without looking back. By the time the sun rose, I convinced myself she had just been overtired or stressed. Night shifts can do strange things to people. She quit the next day by text. No explanation. No goodbye. Her badge was left in a small envelope on the manager's desk. 2 weeks later, management forwarded a quiet internal email instructing supervisors to remove her access codes from all systems. Attached was a short note saying she had been arrested in York County. The report mentioned stalking a former coworker and using unauthorized access to enter his hotel room while he was asleep. The words felt unreal as I read them, like they didn't belong to the same quiet girl who used to stand at the front desk with her headphones on. The same girl who had been whispering alone in the basement in the middle of the night. I thought about that moment again and again. The way she had positioned herself, the whispers, the way she'd reacted when I touched her shoulder. I realized how easy it would have been for someone like her to use those master keys on anyone she fixated on, anyone who wasn't paying attention. The hotel always felt safe to me before that night. Just another building where guests came and went, where nothing truly dangerous ever happened. But sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet hallway or waiting for an elevator in an empty building, I think about how close I was without even knowing it, how easily I could have been the one she chose, and how I never would have seen it coming until it was too late. My first job out of college was in a warehouse on the east side of Sparks, Nevada, the kind of squat concrete building you barely notice when you drive past on I-80. It was early 2021, still cold in the mornings, the air in the loading bay thick with dust and the sour smell of cardboard that had been sitting too long. I worked in inventory, mostly scanning incoming pallets, checking labels, updating spreadsheets on an old desktop that froze at least twice a shift. It wasn't a glamorous start to adulthood, but it paid rent, and everyone kept to themselves enough that the days passed without much friction. The break room sat on the second floor, tucked behind a row of dull windows that overlooked a gravel lot. It had a humming soda machine, a microwave that burned popcorn no matter what setting you used, and a fridge so packed during the day shift that you sometimes had to wedge your lunch into whatever corner you could find. During the afternoon shift, though it was quieter, that was when I usually saw Mike. He drove one of the forklifts, the older kind with chipped orange paint and a seat that leaned hard to one side. He was in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, tall, a bit heavy, and always wearing faded jeans and steel-toed boots that looked one bad week away from falling apart. What stood out wasn't his clothes or even his quietness. It was the way he hovered around the break room fridge. He never touched anything inside except his own food, but he counted. Every single day, he would open the door, lean in, and whisper numbers under his breath while pointing at every lunchbox and container. He did it with a weird focus, like someone reading a ledger. Then he'd close the door gently and walk away, without acknowledging anyone else in the room. At first I assumed he was making sure his lunch wasn't stolen. That happened sometimes, and people got oddly territorial about leftovers. But he counted everything, even food stacked behind other food, even items he couldn't possibly be connected to. Once, when I walked in behind him, I saw him tapping the plastic shelves with the tips of his fingers before stepping back and scanning the room as if checking for witnesses. He never greeted anyone or explained what he was doing. Most people ignored it or joked about it quietly, but no one challenged him. He wasn't unpleasant, just strange in a way that made you avoid eye contact. One day in March, I came in at 11 for a shift that was supposed to be easy. Light workload, steady pace, no big shipments. But even before noon, I could tell the building felt off. The kind of stillness that hangs in the air before a storm. A few people were already irritated about small things, a pallet mislabeled, someone misplacing a handheld scanner, equipment not being where it normally sat. It wasn't unusual for objects to go missing, but it usually happened because people borrowed things without returning them. What bothered me was the frequency. First, a box cutter disappeared. Then a set of gloves someone had left by the loading bay door. Then one of the floor radios wasn't on its hook during the noon check. By early afternoon, tension floated through the warehouse like static. People were muttering under their breath, digging through tables and shelves, checking trucks that had already been loaded. The missing radio finally turned up in a trash bin in the men's bathroom. The wires were torn clean out, the casing cracked like someone had crushed it against a corner. Nobody could figure out why anyone would bother destroying something that old and inexpensive, but the fact that it ended up in the trash unnerved people. You didn't throw equipment away unless you were hiding something. I kept working, trying to stay focused on the spreadsheets, but every time I saw someone patting down a pocket or scanning the floor for a lost tool, I felt that slow, creeping sense that something was unfolding behind the scenes. Not chaos exactly, more like someone rearranging pieces of the day while everyone else was too busy to notice. Around the same time, I saw Mike near the break room. He wasn't eating, he had already finished hours before. He stood with the fridge door open, counting again. I watched from the hallway as he leaned in so close his forehead almost touched the shelf. His lips moved steadily, and his hand trembled slightly with each number. Then he stepped back and stared at the fridge like it had personally offended him. He didn't close the door right away. He just held it open, glaring at the containers inside. When he finally let it shut, he scanned the hallway with sharp eyes and walked down the stairs at a faster pace than usual. Nothing happened for a while after that. People went back to their tasks, though the tension stayed. The day dragged until 40:30, when my shift was finally ending. I went upstairs to grab my bag from the break room. The room was empty, the overhead lights buzzing faintly. My bag was on the usual chair near the microwave, right where I had left it. But when I reached inside for my wallet, my fingers hit empty fabric. At first I thought I had brought it down earlier and left it somewhere else. I checked the floor. I checked the microwave table. I searched every pocket in my bag. Nothing. My stomach tightened. The wallet had all the important things: ID, debit card, emergency cash I barely ever touched. I knew with absolute certainty I had placed it in the inside pocket when I arrived that morning. There was no chance I had misplaced it on my own. By the time I told the shift lead, word had already spread about the other missing items. A few people floated the idea of checking the cameras, not out of accusation but desperation. Everything that had gone missing that day pointed in too many directions to make sense. So we went to the small closet-sized room that held the security system, a cramped space with monitors stacked on cheap metal shelving. The cameras covered every main hall, every loading zone, every stairwell, and the entire break room. The footage played in silence, the timestamp ticking steadily at the bottom. What we saw didn't feel chaotic or impulsive. It looked planned. Mike appeared on almost every camera. He moved calmly, no hesitation, walking from locker to locker, checking bags, opening drawers, moving from one hallway to the next as if following a route he had practiced in his head for weeks. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He didn't act like someone stealing small things for fun or out of anger. He was efficient, detached, focused in a way that made my skin crawl. We watched him pull open my locker. He didn't rifle through it. He lifted things carefully, checked pockets, set items back exactly where they had been. When he found my wallet, he slipped it into his back pocket with this slow, deliberate motion, like someone placing a final piece into a puzzle. Then he closed the locker gently and walked out of frame. The last camera that caught him was the side exit. He walked through the door wearing my jacket, my navy one with a fraying cuff, and hugged 3 lunch bags to his chest like trophies. He didn't run. He didn't look around nervously. He walked with a quiet satisfaction, almost a soft bounce in his step, and a small smile curled on his face. The footage ended a few seconds later as the door swung shut behind him. We called the police. They arrived quickly, took statements, reviewed the footage, and sent out a notice. But Mike was gone. He didn't go home, didn't return the next day, didn't leave anything behind except his forklift, parked slightly crooked near the charging station. They never found him. What stuck with me wasn't the theft itself. People stole things all the time in workplaces. Tools, food, whatever they could get away with. What scared me was the way he'd been counting lunches every day, watching patterns, memorizing routines, waiting for some moment only he understood. The counting hadn't been about food. It had been about control. He was tracking when people were distracted, when the break room was busy, when the fridge was full enough that no one would notice him moving around. He had been preparing. In the weeks after, the fridge seemed emptier. People kept their bags with them or locked them in their cars. The warehouse went back to its usual rhythm, but every time I walked into the break room, I glanced at the fridge door and imagined him standing there again, whispering numbers, organizing the day in a way none of us recognized until it was too late. That job taught me something I still think about now. You can work next to someone for months and never understand the game they're playing in their head. You can assume they're quiet or odd or just keeping to themselves, when really they're cataloging everything around them, waiting for the perfect moment to break whatever thin illusion of safety you think you've built. I left that warehouse later that year and moved into a different field entirely. But every new workplace since then, I watch the small habits people think no one notices. I don't judge. I just pay attention. Because somewhere out there, Mike is still counting something. And now I know better than to assume it doesn't matter. I had been working IT support at a small insurance company in Plano for a little over a year when all of this happened. The office was tucked behind a row of medical buildings, the kind of place where the parking lot always felt a little too empty after sunset. Most nights I left before it got dark, but on the night everything went wrong. We were scheduled to finish a server patch that had been postponed twice already. It was June 2022, one of those humid Texas evenings where the air outside felt heavy even after sunset. Inside, though, the building was cold, the fluorescent lights giving everything a faint green tint, like an old convenience store that hadn't been updated in years. David was the only other person still around. He had a habit of staying late even when he didn't need to. He wasn't a bad employee, just overly eager. He pushed himself into conversations, hovered behind people while they worked, and offered help no one asked for. He liked to know things. Tiny things, private things. He kept track of what people ate for lunch, what time they usually left, how often they called in sick. It was meant to come across as friendly interest, but it always felt slightly off, like a grocery store clerk remembering a detail from 3 months ago that you never told him directly. Most days I just kept my distance. I stayed polite, nodded along, moved to another room when he lingered. I didn't want to be unkind or cause trouble. I learned to excuse myself from conversations early and pretend to be busy. It worked well enough. We finished the last part of the patch around 8:50 p.m. The building was silent except for the faint hum of HVAC and the distant clicking of the cooling server. I packed up slowly, sliding my laptop into my bag and stretching my stiff shoulders. My eyes felt dry from the long day. I remember glancing at the time on my phone, 8:57 p.m., and feeling that instant relief that came with knowing I'd be home soon. Maybe grab something quick to eat on the way. When I walked toward the hallway door, the one that led to the exit, and the small lobby, something felt strange. The door handle resisted when I pulled. It didn't budge. I tried again, harder this time, expecting the usual soft click and swing. Nothing. It was locked from the outside. That wasn't normal. Cleaning staff usually came in at 9, and the door stayed open until they finished, sometimes close to midnight. The lock wasn't just engaged. It felt double locked, like someone had taken the deadbolt and snapped it firmly into place. My first thought was that maybe building management had changed the schedule or the cleaning staff arrived early. I leaned forward, squinting through the narrow wire-reinforced glass pane, but the hallway beyond was dark. The lights always stayed on when cleaning staff were around. The air felt immediately different, too still, too thick for an office, usually buzzing with motion. I turned slightly, already knowing who was behind me before I fully faced him. David stood about 10 feet away, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. His posture was too controlled, his shoulders held tight like someone bracing for a reaction. I asked if he had locked it earlier, but he didn't look confused or apologetic or rushed like a normal person might in that moment. There was something deliberate in the way he stood there. I could see a faint shine on his forehead from the overhead lights, but he didn't look tired. If anything, he looked more alert than he had all evening. I didn't ask why he did it. I didn't want to add anything to the atmosphere already forming between us. I could feel something shifting, like he had been waiting for the room to empty and the building to settle into silence. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. The computers on the desks around us were all off, the monitors dark, the cubicles empty. The whole floor felt abandoned. When he finally turned away and walked toward the far cubicle row, I felt a tug of instinct. Something small and sharp pulling at my attention. I followed him with my eyes and noticed the slight bounce of keys in his pocket. He had them. I didn't want to make a scene. I didn't want to show panic. I just backed away slowly, pretending to check my phone again. I moved toward the other end of the office where the copy room and supply shelves were. The carpet absorbed my footsteps, and every sound in the quiet space felt too loud, even things as simple as the rustle of my bag or the faint buzz from the emergency exit sign. I dialed 911 with the side buttons, keeping the phone shielded by my palm. My voice was low, barely above a whisper when I spoke, giving the address, the situation, and the details as clearly as I could. I didn't raise my voice or sound frantic. I didn't want him hearing anything. While I was talking, I heard the soft, deliberate sound of footsteps shifting direction. He was coming toward me. They weren't quick footsteps. They were measured, like he didn't want to corner me too fast, like he wanted to give me time to think about him approaching. I stepped into the copy room and quietly pushed the heavy door mostly shut, then dragged a box of printer paper with my foot, nudging it against the bottom to slow the door's movement. My hands were shaking, but I tried to keep them steady by squeezing the edge of the table inside. The room was stuffy, warmer than the rest of the office, and smelled faintly of tunner. I listened to the soft creak of floor tiles outside as he reached the hallway leading to the room. I heard him pause outside the door. Not knocking, not speaking, just standing there long enough for me to feel the air on my skin tighten with awareness. I backed deeper into the room, keeping my breathing controlled. I heard faint rustling. His steps shifting position. The lights flickered slightly, something they did occasionally when the server load spiked. But at that moment, the movement of shadows across the floor felt too close, too connected to him standing nearby. Minutes stretched. I didn't hear him walk away, but I didn't hear him move closer either. It was like he was waiting for something. I didn't know if he was listening for my footsteps or waiting for me to try the door. I stayed behind the big multifunction machine, watching the tiny glowing light on my phone blink. The dispatcher kept me on the line, and I tried to keep my voice low and steady. Every small sound in the office seemed magnified, from the hum of overhead lights to the faint whir of the cooling fans inside the copy machine. Then, faint but unmistakable, I heard the building's front door buzzer. The sound echoed through the quiet office like a crack opening in the tension. Another few seconds passed, then heavy knocks carried through the hallway. That was when his footsteps moved quickly, not toward the door, but deeper into the office. It sounded like he was trying to position himself away from the entrance. The officers called out, their steps firm against the tile floor in the hall. More movement followed, voices blending, clear and authoritative. One of them pushed open the office door strongly enough that I heard the latch rattle against the frame. The air shifted, the atmosphere breaking instantly. I stepped out cautiously, and one of the officers guided me toward the hallway while the others located David. He wasn't resisting. He wasn't angry. He just stood there with his hands stiff at his sides, watching everything unfold with an expression I couldn't understand. When they asked him for the key, he reached into his pocket and produced it without hesitation. The officers walked him out while I waited by the copy room door, still trying to steady my breathing. My hands felt cold despite the warmth of the room. One officer stayed with me after everything calmed down. He wasn't writing a report at that moment, just making sure I was okay. He lowered his voice when he told me something he said I didn't need to repeat for any official paperwork. David had been asking, over and over, whether I had said anything weird during the call. He repeated the same question half a dozen times, always with the same controlled tone. The officer said it stood out enough that it made him uncomfortable. HR fired David the next morning. They didn't argue or delay. They handed me a short statement saying they would restrict him from returning to the building and that they were reviewing his access history. They offered me time off, but I didn't take it. I didn't want to sit at home thinking about that locked door and the way he had stood behind me. For weeks afterward, every time I stayed late for maintenance windows or server updates, I found myself checking the hallway door twice before the shift and twice more before leaving. I paid more attention to the small sounds in the office, the way chairs creaked, or how distant footsteps carried along the carpeted aisles. I switched desks to a spot near an exit. It helped, but only a little. I still remember that moment when the door wouldn't open, the strange stillness of the office, and the way he watched me with too much focus. I think what unsettled me the most wasn't what he did. It was realizing that he had thought about it long enough to put the key in his pocket and decide the best moment to use it. The calmness of it, the waiting. Even now, years later, I can still feel that quiet, heavy air of the office at 8:57 p.m., and the simple knowledge that a normal workday can turn into something else entirely when someone decides they want it to. I worked night shifts as a janitor at a mid-size hospital in Portland, Oregon, a place where the fluorescent lights never fully warmed up the hallways, and the smell of disinfectant clung to your clothes long after you left. The nights were always quiet, except for the occasional beeping of monitors, the shuffle of shoes on linoleum, and the distant hum of the ventilation system. You got used to the rhythm after a while, the way the hospital seemed almost asleep but never truly silent. Most of the time, you saw the same faces: tired nurses with dark circles under their eyes, interns who moved too fast and spoke too softly, and security guards leaning against the walls with nothing to do. It was February 2018, a night that started like any other. The air outside had a sharp, wet chill that came with Portland winters, and the hospital corridors smelled faintly of antiseptic and rubber. I had started my rounds at midnight, checking on the patient floors, wiping down nurse stations, and refilling supply closets. The orthopedic wing was one of my last stops. It was quieter than most, a long stretch of hallways lined with patient rooms that had been empty for hours. The linoleum was pale, the kind of color that made every shadow look darker than it was, and the fluorescent lights flickered at the far end near the supply closet. Around 30:20 a.m., I was pushing my mop bucket down the hallway when I noticed her. She was a woman with short hair, wearing navy scrubs and old, worn sneakers. She was mopping a small patch of tile near one of the nurse stations, moving back and forth with slow, deliberate strokes. She didn't speak or even look up as I walked by. For a second, I thought she was new, maybe a nurse's aide or a temporary hire. I gave her a small nod, and she nodded back, still silent, her eyes focused on the floor in front of her. I finished the wing and returned about 40 minutes later. She was still there, in exactly the same position, pushing the mop over the same 3-foot section of tile. The hallway was empty except for her and me. I stood there for a moment, trying to place her face, thinking maybe I had seen her in passing earlier, but it didn't register. There was something unnerving about the way she moved. Too methodical, almost mechanical. I watched her for a few seconds longer, then shook my head and walked on. I told myself she must be new, or maybe covering a cleaning assignment I wasn't aware of. Hours later, during the shift change, I mentioned her to my supervisor. He raised an eyebrow, looked at the schedule, and said no one new had started in the orthopedic wing. I described her. Short hair, navy scrubs, old sneakers, pushing the mop in the same spot for over an hour. My supervisor frowned and pulled up the security cameras from the wing. We watched the footage together. I could see myself walking down the hall, stopping near the nurse station, gesturing slightly as if I were acknowledging someone. There was no one there. The woman wasn't on the cameras at all. Just me standing alone, moving around as if I were talking to someone who didn't exist. I left the footage playing on the monitor and walked down the hall myself, retracing my steps. The hallways were quiet. The nurse station was empty. The mop was gone. There were no footprints or signs that anyone had been there. Security did a sweep, checking supply closets, staff rooms, and maintenance areas. Nothing. The hospital was empty in that wing except for me, the occasional cleaning cart, and the hum of the ventilation. I couldn't shake it. The way she had moved, the way she had looked at the floor with such concentration. It was real. I knew what I had seen, but the cameras told me I hadn't. I spent the rest of the night avoiding that hallway, sticking to floors I knew well, areas where I could see the end of the corridor, without worrying about running into someone who shouldn't be there. The next night, I asked a nurse quietly about unusual staff appearances or people who might have been wandering around. She leaned in, lowering her voice, and told me about problems the hospital had experienced in the past with people sneaking into the building. Some were addicts looking for supplies. Some were relatives of patients who had become unstable. They would wander the halls, sometimes for hours, pretending to belong, blending in with the uniformed staff. She mentioned an incident in 2016 when a nurse had been stabbed by someone who had gotten in and spent the night moving unnoticed through patient areas. That had set off a series of stricter checks, keycard restrictions, and extra security sweeps during night shifts. It was the kind of story that made your skin crawl, the kind that left you constantly aware of every shadow and noise. From that night on, I refused to walk the orthopedic wing alone. I started adjusting my cleaning schedule, arriving earlier or later to avoid the possibility of encountering someone else. I checked doors more carefully, listened for any sounds behind me, and kept the radio low but on, something that made the space feel a little less empty. I never saw the woman again, but I couldn't forget her. The image of her standing there, so focused, so real, and yet entirely untraceable, lingered in my mind. I realized that what I had experienced wasn't supernatural, wasn't impossible. It was just the kind of danger that comes from someone using a hospital's own routines against it, someone invisible until you notice them too late. Months later, I heard about another incident on a different floor. A man had gotten in through a delivery entrance, posed as a maintenance worker, and had to be escorted out by security after wandering for hours. Every time I thought about that night in the orthopedic wing, I understood exactly how someone could be in the building without anyone knowing, how easy it was to become convinced of something you didn't see on cameras, and how much the hospital's usual rhythm could hide a single, quiet threat. Eventually, I moved on from night shifts. I took a day job in a small office building where the most I worried about was a printer jam or someone stealing a stapler. But even years later, walking into hospitals or quiet corridors, I could still feel the unease of that February night, the cold linoleum underfoot, the flickering fluorescent lights, and the memory of a woman pushing a mop over a patch of tile for hours without leaving, blending into the hospital, as if she had always been there, waiting. And I understood why security was so strict, why staff had to check doors and verify identities. Hospitals weren't just busy places. They could be dangerous in the quietest moments, and sometimes the threat was someone pretending to belong, moving silently through your world without anyone noticing until it was too late. I never walked that wing alone again, and I never stopped paying attention to the people who seemed like they belonged. Sometimes the safest thing you can do is trust your own eyes, even when the cameras say you're imagining everything. Back in 2012, I worked the midnight shift at a Chevron in Bakersfield, California. The store sat on a corner where the streetlights barely reach, so the parking lot was a mix of dim pools of light and stretching shadows. I had the overnight shift because it paid a little extra, and it was quiet enough that I could think without constant interruption. My coworker, Ricky, had been assigned to the same schedule. He was a jittery guy, always moving his hands, always snapping at the air when he spoke. He drank energy drinks like water, and his words seemed to come out faster than he could swallow them, leaving a slight rasp, like he was burning his tongue on each syllable. He wasn't unpleasant exactly, just tense. There was a constant edge to him that made the fluorescent hum of the store feel sharper, like even the lights were holding their breath when he was around. That night, the store was mostly empty. A couple of late night drivers trickled through, one in a pickup, one in a sedan, both stopping for gas or snacks, the usual. The hum of the refrigerators mixed with the buzzing of the overhead lights. Ricky had been fidgeting with the trash bags all evening, picking them up, moving them from one end of the room to the other, muttering under his breath. Around 3 a.m, he announced he was going to take the trash to the compactor behind the store. I nodded, not thinking much of it. Trash runs were a normal part of the job, and I had my own duties to handle, restocking drinks, wiping down counters, checking the pumps. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 15. I expected him to be back any moment, but when I glanced toward the back door, it remained closed. I didn't think much at first. Sometimes people got distracted. Sometimes the bags tore. Sometimes the dumpster lid wouldn't open easily. After about 10 minutes, though, I started to feel uneasy. It was the kind of quiet that made even the hum of the fluorescent lights too loud. I slipped on my jacket and walked outside. The air hit me like a wall of diesel and dry dust. Bakersfield had that scent at night in the summer, the smell of fuel dirt, and the faint trace of someone burning trash a mile away. It wasn't unpleasant, but it had a certain weight that made you aware of how empty everything around you was. I walked toward the compactor. The metal door that usually stayed locked and secure was open, and inside, Ricky was standing still, rigid, staring at the far concrete wall. At first, I thought he was looking for something he dropped. Then I saw what he had been doing. He had scratched lines into the wall with a broken piece of metal, deep dark lines gouged into the concrete, creating a map of the gas station. Every door, every aisle, every counter, even the tiny back room he rarely went into. It wasn't messy. It was deliberate, precise, like someone had drawn it 100 times before committing it to the wall. The sunlight in the daytime, or the overhead lights in the store, would make it invisible unless you were looking for it. But in the dim light of the compactor, the scratches caught shadows and looked like they were glowing. I stood there for a long time, just watching him. The quiet stretched between us. There was no explanation in his posture, no hesitation, no glance back. Just the methodical scraping of the metal and the lines, forming a network of paths I knew by heart. I could feel my stomach knotting, the hair on the back of my neck rising. The air in that concrete enclosure felt heavier than outside, denser somehow, as if it had absorbed the stillness of hours past and was pressing down on me. I realized then that he wasn't making a map for fun or out of boredom. He was memorizing something, committing it to memory, committing it to the wall. He traced one line from the back office to the register window with a slow, deliberate motion. My stomach sank as I recognized the path. It was the most direct route for someone to move without being seen by the cameras. It went past blind spots, around corners, through areas that no customer ever looked. It was uncanny how perfectly he had planned it, as though he had imagined himself walking through it, step by step, with the cameras blindfolded. And for a moment, I could see him there in my mind, walking the path without saying a word, silent and exact. I left him there, unsure if I should speak or call someone. It didn't feel right to confront him. Something about the way he stood there, frozen and intent, suggested that any interruption would snap the fragile concentration he had built like breaking glass. I went back inside and finished my shift, but I couldn't shake the image of him standing in that compactor, mapping out the station like a criminal blueprint etched in concrete. My usual routine felt hollow and strained, the fluorescent lights sharper than normal, the hum of the refrigerators louder, more intrusive. I couldn't concentrate on anything. Every movement in the store, footsteps, a soda can rattling on a shelf, the ding of the door when someone walked in, made my skin crawl. Ricky quit the next day. He didn't explain why, didn't leave a note, just disappeared. Management never said much, only that he had requested a transfer that couldn't be accommodated. I went back to the compactor later to check, but the map was partially covered by a fresh coat of grime and dust, as though the night had reclaimed it. I wiped the wall, trying not to think too hard about what I had seen, but it stayed with me. 2 weeks later, the store was hit in the middle of the night. A single person, wearing dark clothing, moved silently through the station. They bypassed every camera, avoided the blind spots I had learned to note during training, and took exactly what they wanted from the registers and safe. The route they followed matched the line Ricky had drawn to the letter. Management was shaken. The police investigated but never caught anyone. There were no fingerprints linking Ricky, no evidence, nothing. But I knew. I remembered every stroke of the broken metal, every precise measurement in the concrete, every line that traced the perfect path through our tiny corner of the world. I still think about it sometimes, when I pass that street late at night, or when I drive past a gas station after dark. I imagine someone standing in the shadows, tracing paths into walls, preparing, planning, knowing exactly where to step to avoid cameras, avoid attention. I never spoke to Ricky again, and I don't think anyone else did. But the image of him in that compactor, methodical, focused, and entirely alone, stayed with me in a way nothing else has. I left the Chevron not long after the robbery. I couldn't shake the sense of awareness that someone could be plotting right under your nose, mapping your world with the kind of obsessive detail that makes reality itself feel fragile. The story doesn't have a neat resolution. Ricky was never caught, the stolen money never returned, and the wall he carved into still waits behind the compactor, silent and patient. It's a reminder, the kind that lingers in the back of your mind, that some people move through the world differently. Closer to the edge, sharper, and entirely willing to make the ordinary terrifying. It was the first time I realized that the ordinary people you work with, the ones who nod at you, who drink too much coffee, who seem harmless, can quietly know the spaces you think are safe, that the routines you trust, the aisles you walk, the cameras you think protect you can all be studied, mapped, and exploited. That understanding still haunts me in the smallest, most banal ways. The hum of a fluorescent light, the smell of diesel, the dull echo of a footstep in a quiet night shift. I remember him there, and I remember how easily the ordinary became something I couldn't ignore. I never saw Ricky again. I don't know where he went or if he was ever the one who committed the robbery. But I knew what I had seen. I knew the way he had watched, planned, and etched that path into concrete. And I knew that once someone sees the world like that, they can't really go back. You notice the corners, the blind spots, the ways the ordinary can be bent and broken. That's the part that stays with you, long after the doors are locked, long after the night shift ends, long after the store closes for good. I worked at a call center in Columbus, Ohio. The building was a nondescript office block on the edge of the city, the kind that looked identical to every other office along that stretch of Olentangy River Road. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed constantly, humming over rows of cubicles that smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and stale coffee. The air was always a little too dry, and in the summer, the air conditioning made your skin itch after a couple of hours. My cubicle was small, standard gray walls, a cheap chair, and a monitor that flickered when the weather changed. Across from me, on the other side of the row, was 12A, and 12A belonged to Theresa. She had been there longer than anyone cared to remember, and she was quiet, extremely efficient. She never talked unless necessary, always kept her desk meticulously organized, and she always wore the same gray cardigan. It had a faint smell of fabric softener and maybe something floral, but never strong enough to be noticeable unless you were close. I first noticed something odd about her in September 2020. The pandemic was still raging in waves, and most of us were on staggered schedules. Our shift ended at 70:30, but Theresa started staying late longer than anyone else. At first, it was an hour or so, but then it became every night. She would still be there past 9, past 10, long after the lights in the rest of the office were off. She never made a sound. You could see her shadowed form through the thin partitions, hunched over her keyboard, moving her fingers fast, fast, fast. I didn't think much of it at first. Some people just liked to work late, I told myself. Some people had deadlines or projects. But as the weeks passed, her behavior began to feel different, off. One night I forgot my headphones. I realized it just after 9:00 p.m., and I went back to the office. The parking lot was mostly empty, lit by the harsh glow of streetlights. The wind carried a chill that made me pull my jacket tighter around my neck. Inside, the building was nearly dark. The janitorial lights were off. The break room had only the faint red glow of the vending machines. The hallways smelled of carpet cleaner and faint sweat, the kind of smell that clings to your shoes. I walked past the cubicle slowly, expecting the emptiness, and then I saw her. Theresa's cubicle light was on. It was a small desk lamp, the only source of warmth in the otherwise dim office. She was sitting there, typing. Only her monitor was off, completely dark, black. Her fingers moved over the keyboard with a speed and precision that was almost mechanical. Her breathing was sharp and rapid, but her eyes never left the empty screen. Her head was slightly down, shoulders tense, hands flying. I stopped for a moment, unsure if I should call her name or just let her work. I tried saying it softly. Theresa. I thought maybe she hadn't heard me. She didn't stop. Her hands kept moving, her head stayed down, her eyes fixed on nothing. I stepped closer and noticed that her cubicle was completely covered in notes. Sheets of paper were taped to every visible surface inside the small walls. Names, dates, arrows pointing to exits, diagrams of desks, scribbles of schedules, notes on which coworkers parked where and at what time. Some papers were crumpled in corners, others perfectly aligned. The writing was neat, obsessive. My stomach sank as I realized she had been documenting everything about everyone. I didn't move. I didn't breathe too loudly, just watched her. Her typing was relentless. Every few seconds, she would glance down at a note, then back at the black monitor, fingers flying. It was hypnotic and terrifying at the same time. I backed away slowly and left the building, my shoes clicking loudly against the tile hallway, the sound echoing in the empty space. 2 days later, HR called everyone in. We were told that Theresa had been placed on leave. The words, behavioral concerns, were repeated like a mantra. Someone had found stacks of handwritten logs in her desk, pages and pages, chronicling the routines, schedules, and habits of everyone who worked there. Each employee had at least a few pages, with details that no one would have shared willingly. The HR representative said she wasn't a danger, but her meticulous record keeping had raised serious concerns. They assured us that it was all being handled, and to continue our work as normal. I tried to move past it, but it stuck in my mind. The notes, the black screen, the speed of her typing, her silence, the feeling of being watched, cataloged, measured. It made me notice little things about my coworkers that I hadn't before. The way someone always left at a certain time, the way someone parked a few feet over, the little habits that we all think are invisible. It made the office feel smaller, more suffocating, like someone was always just behind the wall, watching, recording, waiting. A week after she was put on leave, I was leaving early on a Saturday morning to pick up some supplies. It was just before 6, still dark outside, the sky a deep navy with the faintest hint of approaching dawn. I walked past the parking lot and froze. There, sitting in her car, engine off, was Theresa. She hadn't moved for minutes. I stood behind a column and watched. She was staring straight at our office building, the windows dark, the doors locked, the office completely empty. Her eyes didn't shift. She didn't blink as far as I could tell. The cold air made the windows fog up slightly, and her face pressed against the glass in a way that made it almost indistinct, ghost-like. I considered calling the police, but there was nothing illegal about sitting in a car. I tried to convince myself it was coincidence. Maybe she had a reason, a personal matter, something outside of work. But there was a methodical, unyielding quality to the way she was sitting there, like she was keeping a silent, watchful vigil. I left slowly, avoiding the lot, my stomach heavy. Over the following months, Theresa didn't return. The building eventually relaxed back into its normal rhythm. People forgot the small details. HR never gave an update on what had happened to her, whether she resigned or sought help. But I never forgot the sense of being cataloged, measured, observed. It made me change my routines, the times I left, the way I moved through the office. I started parking in different spots, taking different paths to the printer, trying to make myself less predictable, less readable. I never saw her inside the building again, but I occasionally caught glimpses in the parking lot early in the morning. Always just sitting, always just watching. She never acknowledged anyone. She never moved. Just sitting in that car, her gray cardigan folded neatly on the seat beside her, the notes that had once covered her cubicle burned into my memory. The office never felt completely safe again, and even after she was gone, the thought that someone could study you with such precision, that someone could know every tiny habit without your knowledge, stayed with me. It was over a year before I could enter the building at night without a small, sharp anxiety prickling in my chest. I had learned to accept the mundane rhythm of the office, the hum of fluorescent lights, the click of keyboards, as a fragile kind of safety. But every so often, when I walked past cubicle 112A, I could swear I felt her presence there, typing, watching, cataloging, waiting, and I knew without a doubt that she had been watching us all along. Every move, every pattern, every little vulnerability written down, stored somewhere in that quiet, obsessive mind of hers. The lesson was simple and terrifying in its own way. People can be dangerous not because they yell or fight, but because they notice everything. They remember everything. And even when they disappear, the awareness they've planted in your mind remains, lingering like a shadow you can't shake. That shadow stayed with me, and every time I pass 12A, even years later, I feel it. It is precise, calculated, and completely real. I started a short-term contract in Chicago in the spring of 2023, filling in for a department that handled internal communications for a mid-sized company. The office was a tiny, windowless space on the 5th floor, just barely large enough for 2 desks pushed together. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, and the carpet was a dull gray that had seen better days. My co-worker for the duration of my assignment was a temp named Jonas. He was quiet, methodical, and always arrived at the same time I did, sometimes a few minutes earlier. There was something immediately unsettling about the way he moved, even though nothing he did was overtly strange. He smelled like laundry detergent mixed with a faint metallic tang, and his hands were almost always greasy. I noticed the fingerprints he left on his keyboard, smeared in patterns that suggested he never wiped the surface down. At first, I assumed he was just careless, but over the first week, I started to realize there was a strange rhythm to his day. Every day, without fail, at exactly 1:17 p.m., Jonas would stand up from his desk, pick up his backpack, and leave the office. I would glance at the clock, watch him disappear down the hall toward the restrooms, and continue my work. He was always gone for exactly 7 minutes, never 6, never 8. It was precise, and after a few days, I found myself checking the time almost compulsively. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that some people just had routines that precise. But a subtle unease began to grow in my chest. There was nothing overtly threatening about him. He never said a word to me beyond polite nods in the hallway. But something about the way he moved, deliberate and exact, made the air in our office feel heavier when he was around. One Tuesday in April, curiosity got the better of me. I had a question about a shared spreadsheet and decided to follow him, just to ask it before he disappeared for his routine. I waited until 1:16, then got up and fell into step behind him. He didn't head for the restrooms this time. Instead, he walked past the elevator lobby, turned sharply down a stairwell I had never noticed, and descended the narrow concrete steps to the basement. At the bottom, he pulled a key from his pocket, unlocked a door I hadn't realized existed, and slipped inside without hesitation. I paused just outside, my stomach tightening as I debated whether to knock or leave. I was certain the stairwell was supposed to be empty, that this door was never used by employees. I leaned closer and watched him move inside. 7 minutes later to the second, he emerged, locked the door behind him, and ascended the stairwell. I returned to my desk, my hands trembling slightly, trying to focus on work. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur, and I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe some storage room only he was allowed to access. But the thought gnawed at me. I could feel my pulse every time I looked at the stairwell. The next day, I waited until the office was empty except for me, and then I made my way down to the basement myself. The stairwell was colder than the rest of the building, damp with the smell of concrete and old paint. I unlocked the door, half expecting it to be empty or filled with ordinary supplies. Instead, the room was dimly lit by a single fluorescent tube overhead that buzzed intermittently, throwing shadows across every surface. The smell hit me immediately: paper, ink, and the faint coppery scent of metal. Dozens of binders lined shelves that ran from floor to ceiling, each stuffed with hundreds of printed pages. I picked one up at random and my stomach sank. The pages were printouts of emails from employees across the company. Private messages about financial troubles, divorces, health problems, family disputes. I flipped through a few more and found messages I had sent myself. Every single word I had written in my professional and personal emails had been captured, printed, and filed meticulously. I felt a chill run down my spine. The level of obsession required to do this was staggering. Each binder was labeled carefully with dates and the names of employees. Jonas had been printing every email that passed through the company server. It was methodical, relentless, and deeply invasive. My mind reeled as I imagined the hours he must have spent every day, sneaking away to this basement, cataloging the lives of everyone in the building. I realized he had been doing this for weeks, maybe months, without anyone noticing. I went straight to HR the next morning. They listened, pale and shocked, then left to confront him. I sat at my desk, trying to keep my hands from shaking. The confrontation didn't last long. By the time I returned from getting coffee, the HR staff looked frazzled. Jonas had grabbed his backpack and run out of the building at a full sprint. Security searched for hours, combing the stairwells, parking lots, and even calling the police, but he had disappeared. Every attempt to trace him online or through his temp agency returned nothing. 2 days later, I realized my own email account had been compromised. My password had been changed without my request, and I had to spend a frustrating half-day regaining access and resetting every single security measure. Every notification, every alert, every system message reminded me that my private information had been in someone else's hands. It was a tangible reminder of how close Jonas had been to my life, how methodical and calculating he had been. The anxiety lingered long after the initial shock. I found myself double, checking every lock, every email, every document I sent. Every time I heard footsteps in the office, my pulse would spike. The rest of my time in that Chicago office felt surreal. I kept glancing at the stairwell, half expecting to see him emerge from the shadows. I avoided unnecessary trips through the basement and tried not to think about the binders and the endless printouts. I kept my focus on my work, but the sense of violation stayed with me. Even when I left the building for the last time at the end of the contract, I felt a lingering tension. The memory of that buzzing fluorescent light and the smell of ink and paper etched in my mind. Looking back, it wasn't a grand or dramatic horror. There were no threats, no confrontations, no violence. But the way he systematically invaded the privacy of everyone in the office was profoundly unsettling. It was a quiet, creeping kind of terror that left me constantly aware of how vulnerable I had been without even realizing it. I still think about Jonas sometimes, wonder where he is, what he might be doing, and whether anyone else's information has been quietly captured and stored somewhere in his meticulous, obsessive world. It was a lesson in how ordinary people can be terrifying in the most mundane, bureaucratic spaces, and it left a mark I don't think I'll ever forget. I had been working at the bank headquarters in Charlotte for a few years, and like most people, my routine had settled into a predictable rhythm. I would arrive just after 8 in the morning, usually making it to my desk by 8:30, and I would leave around 6:10 in the evening. My workday was long, mostly paperwork, spreadsheets, and meetings, but it was familiar, and I liked the predictability. Across the street from the building, there was a 6-level parking garage where employees were allowed to park. I had my usual spot on level 3 near the corner, close enough to the exit ramp so I could get out quickly if I needed to. I had driven that route for years without incident, never thinking much about it. It was a warm evening in May 2019 when the routine broke in a way that lodged itself in my mind. I remember leaving the office, my bag slung over my shoulder, the last rays of sun cutting through the office windows in long streaks, and the air outside carrying the heavy scent of asphalt warmed by the spring sun. I had parked on level 3, just like always, and as I approached my car, I noticed Aaron. He was leaning against the side of my vehicle, his posture casual but with a stiffness that didn't belong in casualness. Aaron had always struck me as a little off, someone whose smile seemed stretched and whose laugh was just a fraction late, like he was a beat behind everyone else. He wasn't threatening in a clear, overt way, but there was always something about him that made you watch your step without really understanding why. That evening, the unease hit me immediately. He stood there, tilting his head slightly, the kind of half smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. My stomach sank because it felt deliberate, like he had been waiting there, just waiting, knowing exactly when I would appear. There was a sense of calculation in the way he was leaning on my car, casual only on the surface. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was overreacting, but the tension was real, pressing against my chest. I could feel the dull thrum of anxiety creeping into my limbs as I unlocked my car door, fumbling slightly with my keys. As I climbed into the driver's seat, I caught the way Aaron's eyes tracked me, following every movement. His presence filled the space around the car, heavy and unnerving. When I started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him raise a hand to tap on the trunk. Two slow, deliberate knocks that felt like a signal, like he was marking the moment. My pulse quickened, and I drove out of the garage faster than I normally would have, heart hammering in my chest. The streets were quiet that night, only the hum of my tires against the asphalt. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been waiting, studying me, and it made the world feel suddenly unfamiliar. The next morning, my unease didn't subside. As I approached my car, I noticed a small folded piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. My hand trembled slightly as I picked it up, unfolding it slowly. Written in neat, precise handwriting were the numbers 6010, the exact time I left every day. My stomach dropped, and the parking garage that had always felt neutral now seemed like a stage for something calculated and potentially dangerous. I felt exposed in a way I hadn't felt before, like someone had stepped into my life and left a mark that I couldn't ignore. I immediately went inside to report it to security. They took it seriously, more seriously than I had expected. Over the next day, they reviewed the security cameras from the night before. What they found confirmed the worst of my fears. Aaron had been moving through every level of the garage, his figure captured on camera over and over again, methodically checking the levels as if he were making a map in his head. He carried something in his hand, and when they zoomed in, the object was unmistakably a box cutter. The footage was precise and clear, showing him walking deliberately, checking each corner, each car. By the end of that day, Aaron was terminated. The decision was immediate, final, and necessary, but that knowledge didn't erase the lingering tension. Even after he was gone, the thought of him standing there, observing me, knowing my routine, the way he had moved so deliberately through the garage, stayed with me. For weeks, I couldn't leave the office at the same time. Every evening, I forced myself to vary my schedule, leaving 5 minutes earlier one day, 10 later the next. I would pause in the lobby, wait for someone else to exit first, or linger at the coffee machine, forcing my body to break free from a habit that had once been so comforting. The parking garage became a place of hyper-awareness. I studied every corner as I walked through it, my senses alert to the slightest sound or shadow. Every reflection in a car window, every movement of a passerby, set my nerves on edge. I started taking alternate routes to my car, weaving between levels I had never used before, trying to remove any predictability from my exit. The simple act of leaving work, something I had done thousands of times without a second thought, became a careful, deliberate process. Months passed, and the tension gradually eased, but it never fully disappeared. Whenever I see someone leaning casually against a car in a parking garage, my pulse quickens slightly. I've maintained the habit of varying my departure time for years, and though it feels obsessive at times, it has become second nature. The experience left me with a heightened sense of awareness, a recognition that danger doesn't always announce itself with a scream or a confrontation. It can arrive in the quiet, in the waiting, in the meticulous observation of your routines. Looking back, I realized that the real horror wasn't just Aaron or his actions. It was the sudden awareness of vulnerability, the realization that someone could watch, calculate, and plan without you ever noticing. That knowledge doesn't go away. It changes the way you move through the world, the way you think about spaces that once felt neutral or safe. For me, it became a lesson in vigilance, in the need to respect unpredictability, and in the quiet but profound understanding that even the most ordinary places can hold the potential for danger. In the end, the situation was resolved in the most tangible way possible. Aaron was no longer a threat, removed from the environment where he could act on his intentions. Security measures were reviewed and strengthened, and the note was a singular, isolated incident. But for me, the psychological impact lingered. It reshaped a simple routine into a complex strategy of self-protection. Leaving work became a conscious act, each step measured, each exit varied. The sense of safety I had taken for granted was gone, replaced by a cautious awareness that continues to guide me years later. The story has a clear ending. The immediate danger was removed, the person responsible held accountable, and the incident investigated. Yet the subtle, personal consequences, the change in perception, the heightened vigilance, the awareness of routine as a potential vulnerability, remain a permanent part of my experience. It is a quiet, personal horror grounded in reality and fully resolved in its tangible sense of security, though the lessons it left continue to shape my everyday life. The memory of that night in May still comes back to me, not as a vivid scream or a sudden fright, but as a creeping awareness of how fragile routine can be. I can never go back to leaving at the exact same time, and I have no desire to. I have learned that some threats are silent, patient, and meticulous. They don't need to shout or rush, and the only way to navigate the world safely is to recognize that patience and calculation exist in others, sometimes right alongside you, unnoticed until the moment you realize how vulnerable you really were. I used to work at a marketing firm in Seattle that was squeezed into a tall, gray office building downtown, the kind of place that smells faintly of printer toner and stale coffee, with fluorescent lights that hum constantly, and the faint scrape of chairs on cheap carpet. My office was on the 4th floor, and at the very end of the narrow hallway was a conference room labeled Foy B. Most people avoided it. The motion-activated lights in that room didn't always work, and the windowless interior gave it a kind of permanent shadow even during the day. No one booked it often, and whenever it was used, it always seemed to feel quieter than the rest of the office. On my own, I never liked it much. The door creaked slightly when it moved, and the little label on the frame had chipped letters. That door always looked slightly off, like it didn't belong. It was a January morning in 2020, one of those gray, early mornings when the city still smells of damp concrete and wet leaves from the night before. I had to get in early to finish a presentation, so I arrived around 6:35 a.m., the street still mostly empty and the sky a flat, pale gray. Inside, the office smelled faintly of leftover food from the night cleaners and the weak aroma of burnt coffee from the machines someone had left on the previous evening. My footsteps echoed in the hallway as I walked past cubicles and empty desks, the air cold and sharp with the heat from the vents just barely warming the space. The whole floor was quiet, unnaturally quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you notice your own breathing and the subtle hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. As I passed room 4B, I noticed the door was half open. I hadn't seen it like that before. Usually it was closed or locked when unused. A slight chill ran through me as I slowed my pace, my hand brushing the edge of the door. I was expecting an empty room, maybe a chair out of place or a forgotten coffee cup. I reached for the door to push it fully closed, and at that exact moment the motion light flickered on, buzzing faintly. Inside, at the long conference table, sat Paul, my coworker. Paul had a way of standing out in the office, even when he wasn't doing anything. He had a certain stillness, a posture that made him seem bigger somehow, more deliberate. That morning, sitting there in the dark, hands folded, he was staring straight at the door. His expression was impossible to read, calm but rigid, as though he had been waiting for me. The way he looked at me, I could tell he had been there for a while. My chest tightened without any conscious thought. The air in the hallway felt suddenly heavier. He rose, moving past me without breaking eye contact. I could hear the slight scrape of his shoes on the cheap carpet as he passed. His presence felt calculated, like he had chosen that moment specifically. He made no sound beyond the faint rustle of fabric, no sudden movements, nothing aggressive. But there was something about the way he carried himself that made the hairs on my neck stand up. It wasn't the kind of fear that comes from immediate danger. It was a subtle, creeping sense of violation, the kind that lodges itself somewhere in your chest and refuses to leave. I left quickly after that, telling myself it was nothing, that I was imagining it. When I reported it to my manager, she shrugged. Early workday enthusiasm, she said, brushing it off like a small, inconsequential thing. She didn't look concerned. I tried to laugh it off with a colleague, but no one else seemed to notice, and there was no way to describe the weight of the look he had given me without sounding paranoid. For the next 2 weeks, I kept an eye out, avoided the end of the hallway, and tried to convince myself that I had misread a situation. But one evening, a notice went around from building security. Paul had been caught inside the office at 3:14 a.m., wandering through locked offices with a stolen keycard. They found him sitting quietly at a desk, leafing through personnel files. My own file was among them. The way the security team described it, methodical, careful, deliberate, was chilling. Every detail, from the exact time to the careful avoidance of the cameras in some areas, made it clear that this wasn't random curiosity. He had been studying the people in the office, watching, planning. After that, Paul was fired. There was no trial, no drawn-out investigation, just immediate termination and a warning to staff that security would be extra vigilant. Still, even knowing he was gone, the memory stayed. I could see him in the dark, the half-light of 4B flickering across his face. I could feel the weight of him moving past me, the way he had claimed the space before I had even entered. It wasn't a dramatic scene. He didn't chase me or yell. He didn't threaten me physically. That's what made it worse. It was the calm, quiet certainty that he had been observing me, that he had taken notice in a way that was precise and deliberate. Even weeks after he was gone, I found myself arriving early, heart tightening as I passed 4B. I would pause, half expecting to see that still figure at the table waiting. Sometimes I would catch myself checking the locks on my office door, counting the steps I took in the hallway, listening for the faintest echo of movement when the floor was empty. It became a pattern I couldn't explain. The sense that someone could be there, watching, even when I knew the office was empty, was enough to make me avoid that end of the hallway entirely. Eventually, I stopped coming in quite so early. I adjusted my schedule so that I was never alone in the office for long stretches. The building felt different after that. I started noticing little things I hadn't before. The faint scratches on the carpet near the printers, the way the motion light sometimes took just a second too long to turn on, the way shadows seemed to cling to the edges of the hallway, even in broad daylight. Nothing overtly threatening, nothing that could be pinned on him, but the atmosphere carried his memory, the quiet, careful observation, the way he had made an ordinary space feel invasive and personal. In time, it became easier to talk about it with colleagues, though even then I had to be careful. People wanted it to be a simple story: coworker stayed late, did something wrong, got caught. But for me, it was never that simple. It had been intimate in a way that no security report could ever convey. The invasion wasn't loud or violent. It was methodical, precise, and entirely unnerving. That look in the dark was enough to unsettle me for weeks, and it lingered longer than anything else. I eventually left the company for another job, one with a smaller office, better locks, and no shadowed conference rooms at the end of the hallway. I never saw Paul again. I don't know what he did with all the files, or if he targeted anyone else before getting caught. But the memory of that quiet morning, of walking past 4B and seeing him sitting there like he owned the space, is something that stays. It comes back sometimes when I'm walking alone in a building, when I hear footsteps that don't match my own, when I feel the chill of early morning air in a space that should feel empty. It's a simple story of a man, a room, and a moment of presence that felt too deliberate to ignore, and it's one I will never forget.